Alright, so a lot of people might not agree with me on this one, especially the ones salty because of solo queue, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. One of the most fun aspects of Splatoon is how, to a certain extent, you cannot win matches by yourself. Wait, let me rephrase that in a more positive light. Again, one of the most fun aspects of Splatoon is how team play dynamics are so central to the game. Splatoon is a team game, and for that reason, no matter how good you are, when you're facing people at the same skill level as you are, you'll always need to work with your team, and your team will need to work with you if you all want to get that win. Yes, it is frustrating at times for us solo queue soldiers, but if you ever watch a match of competitive Splatoon and see the game being played by teams where every single player actually knows how to play the game properly and how to play as a team, I have no doubt you would agree with me that this is one of the qualities that makes Splatoon much more fun and interesting, being able to observe and understand how each weapon and each role on a team affects the team as a whole. By spectating the whole team and not only one player's point of view, it becomes that much easier to realize how important it is to have the whole team acting in sync and working together to reach a goal, which can only be achieved if each player knows what they should be doing at each moment. If we were to make an analogy, it really works like a clock, where if every wheel inside of it is working as it should and it's fulfilling its purpose, then the whole clock simply works. But if even one wheel decides not to do its job, then the whole clock will have problems. Now, what's crazy is that if we were to look around from the perspective of that one wheel that's not doing its job, it would really seem as if it was the rest of the clock that wasn't functioning properly, not itself. Because when we're limited to our own point of view, we aren't really able to see how our own performance is affecting others. So, instead of looking at others and pointing at what they're doing wrong, this is the series where we have a look at ourselves and see what we can do to improve our own game in order to ensure that we will be doing our part correctly in order to really contribute to our whole team's performance. Because this is my guide in Splatoon roles and positions, and today we are having a look at the Slayer role. Welcome everyone, this is your boy Samba speaking. I hope you've enjoyed our last video about the support role, and if you haven't seen it yet, do check it out first, because it is very important to understand every role in the game, even the ones that are not yours on the team, so you can be able to work together without stepping on anyone's toes and knowing exactly what to expect from your teammate. I'll be linking that first video on your top right corner right about now, so do check it out. Also, I want you guys to know that I read your feedback on the last video, and I was really happy to see I was able to help so many of you. And I really want to thank you all for leaving a comment. You are the sole reason why I decided to start this series, and your comments were the motivation I needed to keep doing it. I'm sorry it took so long, as I wasn't expecting everything that was coming with 2020, but let's not make you wait even a second longer, and let's get to the video. Slayers. Perhaps for being the most elementary, sometimes the only role in most shooter games, the Slayer role, in my opinion, is also the most misunderstood role in Splatoon. Considering how most shooter games have conditioned their players to have killing as their primary and sometimes only objective, when those same players transition to Splatoon, they end up sadly falling victim to that mindset. And that is because killing in Splatoon isn't by far your main goal, and in theory it isn't even necessary, as it is technically possible to win a match without having any kill. Splatoon is a game where you've actually got an objective to work with. But as a result of that mindset from other games, many players, especially at lower ranks, end up not taking over the many responsibilities a Slayer has in the game, because all they did was look for kills and chase players the whole match. And what's worse is that the information that is displayed on the after game screen reinforces that line of thinking. making this type of players believe that they're actually doing well when they see their name on top with a high kill count, as if that was the whole story of a match. Now, before I say anything else, I want to say that there's nothing wrong if you identify yourself in that description. It is, in my opinion, the most common misconception people have in this game. And actually, kills do matter, but on the right context. So, the thing is, better than a Slayer who can get kills is a Slayer who's able to properly read the game and actually understand what's happening in order to evaluate where and how they are most needed at that moment. Because if you're able to do that, kills come to you naturally as a result of having proper positioning, being at the right places where your team really needs you, pushing on adequate moments, and defending in a conscious manner, instead of getting kills and getting killed because you spent the whole match running around with no purpose, just chasing players and farming kills that weren't always helpful to your team. I know this might sound a bit confusing at first, and you might be asking yourself, how is it that kills might not be useful? But when we're finished with this guide, I'm sure you'll understand that while it's true that having the mechanical skill to be able to win 1v1s does play a part in how successful you are as a Slayer, most of the foundation of what actually makes a good Slayer, a Slayer that really is helpful to their team, is built over some very basic and yet important game sense concepts that don't really require you to be a killing machine. So, the first change of mentality a Slayer has to go through is to realize that, as I've mentioned, in Splatoon, you are not really looking for kills. You are actually looking for control, and this is how you win the game. Because the team that is going to win in the end isn't the one who got the biggest number of kills, but the one who was able to take control of the objective, then take control over the map, and then take control over the enemy team in order not to let them stop you from pushing the objective until you finally win. So, who cares for how many kills you've got? In Splatoon, it is all about control. And contrary to what many might think, especially at lower ranks, that control most of the time doesn't come from big heroic plays coming from one player only, and watching pros playing ranked might increase that misconception. If a player is able to slay the whole lobby repeatedly, that simply means that they're at a higher skill level than everyone else there. But that's not something that you'll ever see happening in a balanced competitive match. Establishing control, in reality, is the result of a series of small, consistent, good decisions from the whole team. What makes Splatoon such a complex game is precisely the fact that every single thing that happens in a match can be traced back as a result of something else, like a domino effect. Of course, there is a time and place to go for those high-risk, high-reward plays, and there are moments when they're even necessary. But for most of the time, what your team needs and expects from you is consistency, because you can't usually brute force your way through. You really have to take control little by little. And that, in other words, means making plays that don't put you at a life or death risk all the time, and that still brings something, however small, to the table. Something that contributes to your team's overall control, but that for not getting you killed in the process, it allows you to keep contributing. What you've got to always keep in mind is that very rarely you win a match in a single play, especially when going against good players. So, 99% of the time, you don't want to go on a suicide mission, where most of your players, if not all of them, will end up dead, because that only gives the enemy team a free counter push, where they can possibly do a better job than your team with keeping control, and they can possibly get the lead or win the match from that advantage. So again, what you want is consistency, to be able to establish and maintain control until you finally win. So, having established that first, now we must define what is it that defines control. Even though control is usually the result and combination of many actions that put your team in an advantageous position, you can still make use of three simple parameters to judge how much control a team has at a given moment. First, we need to look at map control, because as obvious as it is, the amount of paint a team has on the floor is a factor of advantage. Having paint on the floor means they'll have an advantage in fights that happen on that turf, since they'll be able to hide and swim more freely. By having painted the map, they'll also have most probably charged up their specials as well, which increases their advantage even further. And logically, the less paint the enemy team has on the floor, the less control they'll have, and the less your team has to worry with enemies sharking behind or beside you, being able to focus completely at what's in front of you and better prepare for any attacks incoming from there. Second, we need to look at man advantage at the hot zone of the map, and here it's especially important to mention the hot zone, because it doesn't matter if all of your players are alive if they're back at your spawn zone. You need players alive at an area of the map where they can actually impact on the game and be prepared to counter the enemy team, because Splatoon isn't a game where you usually can win 1v2s or anything like that. So if the enemy comes with man advantage, that usually means they'll be able to have at least one player remaining when everything is over, if they're playing their cards right. That's why it's so important to have players properly positioned, ideally with their special charge when pushing or when resisting a counter push. If even one of your players is not where they should be, that can be the start of the domino effect that will eventually make you lose that engagement. And third, we need to look at who has control of the objective. This is something that should go without saying, but as anyone who has ever played enough of solo queue can tell you, a lot of people forget about the objective during a match. But by playing objective is how you win in Splatoon. Whether when playing offense or defense, you can never forget about the objective, as it is the most important element on a match. You can even get to wipe the enemy team repeatedly, but if you don't have control of the objective, you're not getting any closer to victory because of that. Understanding how to identify what is the current state of control is a must-have skill for a Slayer player, as that's the main condition that is going to dictate what they're allowed to do at a given moment. And helping their team establish control should ultimately always be a Slayer's main goal. So, now that we have already dispelled any misconceptions about the role and we know exactly what it is that we're aiming for, it should be a lot easier to understand the other responsibilities a Slayer player actually has that go beyond just getting kills. And one of those responsibilities is knowing how to work with the clock. Whether your team needs to get the lead or not to lose it, the clock or the points running by the clock will ultimately be what's going to dictate what actions are needed from a team and how soon they'll need to perform them. That is extremely valuable information, because that means that frequently actions a team will perform are somewhat predictable, and for that reason you can be prepared for when they happen. That's something that the whole team needs to be aware of, but the Slayer in special needs to know how to identify those moments and how to prepare for them, and how to position themselves appropriately in order to be able to get control back or to keep it. This is where it finally becomes apparent the reason why it was so important to understand before anything else why you're looking for control and not for kills. A Slayer player that has as his main goal looking for kills might end up being unnecessarily aggressive in situations which didn't really call for it and sometimes didn't allow it either, resulting in that player frequently fitting or getting bad traits, which don't contribute to their team's control or victory. Now, a Slayer player who has getting control as his highest priority though, is better equipped to properly judge when that aggression is needed and when it isn't. and they're also equipped to judge what are the appropriate moments to try and push or counter push, and whether the amount of control their team has actually allows them to try and go for a pick, or if maybe other actions on their part will actually contribute more to their team at that moment in a safer way. Slayer weapons usually are weapons that, if you're not paying attention enough, they can sneak on you and the whole team can get wiped by a single player on a couple of seconds because their mobility and their high DPS allow it. And for that reason, Slayers are not players that you want to be caught sleeping around. And that is why it is so important that a Slayer player avoids as much as they can getting killed unnecessarily, because their mere presence on the HUD on the top of the screen represents a threat. If you ever watch good, experienced players, such as one of our professional teams, you'll see that they will always try to avoid feeding the enemy team's Slayer when their location is unknown, which means that they will sometimes think twice before moving up whether to paint or to go for the objective, at times even allowing the enemy team to keep their control for a bit longer in exchange of finding out exactly where that player is. Because putting yourself out of position and exposing yourself out of ink only means that you're facilitating the job of a Slayer, a player who's already sharking and waiting to kill you. But if that Slayer on the enemy team is dead, that means you can have a very big threat out of your mind, and everyone on your team can feel safer when moving to certain positions. So, for a Slayer player, that's a very important realization to have. You don't always need a kill in order to control an area or to stop the enemy team from moving up, because keeping them retreated can be enough depending on the situation, since the clock is always running. Because an enemy that's alive but that can't reach the objective and that can do anything to stop the objective isn't really a threat to your victory, and that's the goal. And that's the reason why you don't necessarily need kills. If your enemy isn't on a suicide mission, they will be able to see that if they keep progressing any further, you will be there to fight them, most probably with a special and a teammate to aid you, and going head-on only means that they will have to take their chances on a 1v1 or a 1v2, and that they can end up losing that engagement without accomplishing anything. And for the same reason, if you go after an enemy and they back all the way up, if you have the bigger picture in mind and taking the clock into consideration, you can realize that there's no need to keep chasing just to get a kill, if that means you're risking getting baited and killed instead. Knowing when to disengage on an enemy that no longer represents an immediate threat is an important call of judgment that comes naturally from having a mentality focused on control instead of kills. And that's why, contrary to popular belief, being aggressive isn't necessarily a quality that defines a Slayer player. You either get aggressive because the situation calls for it, or you have an aggressive playstyle because the level of your mechanics, skill, and game sense allow it, which honestly isn't the case for most people. But if you rush enemies all the time, regardless of context, because you only have getting picks in mind, that means that you will be frequently putting yourself out of position and into situations where you're usually in disadvantage because you weren't paying attention to the general context of the game. And that can only result on you getting easily killed and leaving a door open for the enemy team to start building control, putting your team in disadvantage, which is the opposite of what you wanted. But if instead you play patiently, focusing on getting control and playing accordingly, you will find out that all of those mistakes that you are not doing, the enemy team is, and you can capitalize on that awareness. So, just in case it isn't clear why a Slayer should avoid so much feeding, first of all, when you're dead, it means that the person who would have represented that threat on our front line won't be present for the next almost 10 seconds, which, in comparison, is the same amount of time the tower takes from one checkpoint to another at tower control. During that time, the Slayer on the enemy team might take the opportunity to move up to places where they wouldn't be able to get to normally without fighting our team Slayer on the way, perhaps making our backliner have to jump back to spawn, or perhaps getting a pick on a player who was counting on you to successfully keep that Slayer backed up and that was caught off guard. The enemy team's support might feel safer with the removed threat to gain more turf for their team and charge on armor, for example, to initiate their push. Their backliner might assume a more aggressive position than they would usually be able to assume, forcing our players to back up even further. And that's how the enemy team will start establishing their own control. Of course, all of those things won't necessarily happen exactly like that, but the idea is that a team's frontliner being dead, more than putting the enemy team on a man advantage position, it also gives the enemy team a bigger amount of freedom than they would usually have, because your support and backline players can't always make up for a missing Slayer. That's why another big responsibility of a Slayer on a team is not feeding. Now, feeding isn't the same as just dying, as inevitably you'll eventually die on a match, but the actions that preceded that death could have been meaningful and useful enough for your team. Feeding, however, is when a Slayer, or any player for that matter, repeatedly doesn't create any meaningful impact on a match, so they don't contribute in any meaningful way to their team's control or push, and they end up putting themselves in a position where they can get easily killed. Even a trade, depending on the context, might not be useful to their team if it didn't alter the state of control, since the enemy teams lost a player, but so did your team. That's why feeding is especially damaging to your team, precisely because you weren't able to contribute for the previous seconds when you were alive, and you won't be able to contribute for the next 10 seconds or so because you're dead. Now, imagine doing that repeatedly. Having that in mind, knowing when your push or counter push needs to slow down or when it's over, and knowing when to back up or just wait is a call of judgment just as important as everything else. If the enemy team is able to get the picks on your team because mistakes were made, if they use all of their specials and your team didn't have the specials to counter them, or if for any reason the pressure gets too high and most probably you will die as a result of it, backing up means that you're giving up some of your control but not all of it, because if you're dead and your whole team dies, the enemy team can simply take the whole map back and make a push for free. But if you back up, you're still in battle. You're still keeping the enemy team from moving up freely and establishing full control. And that's not really a bad position for your team, because you always want to prevent the enemy team from getting full control, since you never want to risk your team being put on a lockdown which they might not be able to overcome. For the same reason, flanking is also something to be careful about, and knowing how to flank properly is another responsibility of a Slayer player. Every flank is a high-stakes gamble, because while you're taking a long route to the back of your enemies, painting as little as you can trying to go unnoticed, you're also leaving the enemy team with the same amount of freedom as if you were dead. Putting that much at risk, the only way for a flank to pay off would be for you to get enough picks on the enemy team to put your team at a position of advantage. Because if by the end of your journey all you can manage is to get a trade, or worse, not even a single pick before you die, then you've sacrificed a lot for essentially nothing. And that's why most of the time it is way more interesting for your team to have you at the front line, turfing, putting out consistent damage, making your presence felt, because even if you're not killing anyone, you're still doing your job of keeping the enemy team from progressing freely. That doesn't mean, however, that a Slayer should never flank. It only means that flanking should be a decision based on a necessity of your team. You might flank to get to a backliner, for example, who keeps stopping your team's push from a place where you wouldn't be able to get to normally, so you need to flank to get to him and allow for your team to keep progressing. You might flank to single a player out, perhaps a player that has been single-handedly slaying your whole team, so your team can be able to effectively build control. You might flank to stop a player from using their special, such as a bomb rush that would instantly cap the zone, or a stingray that would stop the rainmaker or the tower. Whatever the reason is, flanking not only has to justify putting everything else at risk, but most importantly, it has to pay off to be worth it. If the situation at hand doesn't call for a flank though, a Slayer is the player who's expected to be either protecting the objective, protecting the player pushing the objective, or to be clearing the way for the objective, instead of being the one stuck playing objective directly. Now, let me clarify that. Every single player on a team should play objective, but each role plays it differently. Of course, there are some very specific situations, especially when the objective is just a couple of points from getting the lead or from KOing, and in such cases, of course, a Slayer should forget everything else and just play objective even if it kills him. Most of the time, however, the responsibility of a Slayer player should be to either make your enemies back up so they can reach or push the objective any further, or else the Slayer should be killing all of those enemies who represent an active threat, so they have to go through another round of respawn before they can try and get to the objective again. Everyone on a team can try and do that, but Slayers are the ones with the weapons most optimal for that, and it's part of their responsibility taking that risk. So eventually, playing Slayer does mean that you'll have to take risks in order to get kills, but going at it, keeping in mind the current state of control, makes it less of taking risks for kills and more of capitalizing on opportunities to expand your control and exploit mistakes on the enemy team. So, taking it out of abstract terms, that is the difference in between a player that rushes by themselves an area where their team doesn't have yet any sort of control, and a player who pushes with their team as they expand their control. Of course, it is no surprise when that Slayer who rushes by themselves isn't able to win a 1v2 or a 1v3, sometimes even a 1v4 on enemy turf. Truly, good Slayers won't even take a 1v1 without having some sort of advantage. So, having more paint on the ground than your enemy is an advantage. Having a special charged is an advantage. Staying close to your team so your teammates can have your back and pile on damage with you, that's an advantage. That's stuff that everyone knows, but that in practice, in the heat of the moment, it ends up being forgotten and not taken into account. But frequently, that's what ends up being the deciding factor which determines who is going to win an engagement. Players who are not aware of those conditions usually will feel like they lost an engagement either because the other player was better mechanically or that it was the result of pure RNG, that it was random. But players who are aware of those conditions know exactly what are the advantages or disadvantages they have when going into an engagement, which is what it is going to help them make better, informed decisions. Just to expand on that, there are many practices that put you in a position of advantage, and good players should always try to look for those opportunities and make use of them, such as making use of your teammate's special to push up on enemies, since missiles, Stingray, and even the Rainmaker Blast are specials that will usually leave your enemies distracted trying to avoid taking damage, which in turn, it creates an opening for you to push up without attracting as much attention and possibly capitalize on that and get picks on enemies that have been damaged and left weak. Also, pairing your special with your teammate's special gives you a huge advantage, such as pairing your missiles with a Stingray before pushing, or waiting for your teammate's armor to use your inkjet. You can also simply pair up and move with weapons that deal blast or splash damage, since they will usually leave enemies damaged enough for you to have an easier time consolidating those kills. And, of course, there isn't a single situation where you don't want to have your team with you when pushing, as that is the biggest advantage you can have. These, among others, are all simple and yet effective practices that separate decent slayers from the good ones, slayers who are smart enough only to take engagements they're confident they can win instead of gambling with their lives, what we call a 50-50. So, as a result of that changing mentality of taking unnecessary risks, slayers who actively think in terms of control and opportunities are less prone to make mistakes and go for plays that are incoherent with the current state of the game. For example, a slayer who finds themselves under the enemy's basket while the enemy team is actively pushing and maybe scoring on our team is a slayer who wasn't paying attention to all the signs that pointed out that our team didn't have control at that moment. A slayer who's trying to spawn camp the enemy team and that ends up feeding in the end probably is a slayer who wasn't aware that our team didn't have control enough and they probably didn't have any support for them to be there at that moment. A slayer who drops desperately from safety and gets killed immediately trying to stop the enemy team's push is a slayer who wasn't trying to build control with their team and rather went for the hero play. Having control is the biggest advantage you can ever have when taking an engagement, and the role of a good slayer is knowing how to identify that in a match and how to make good use of it when leading their team. If you do that, kills become a result of your game, not the main objective. So that's it, guys. These are the fundamentals of what it means to play as a slayer. And I can assure you that if you keep these concepts in mind, it should be already enough to help you start playing the role in a way that not only will prevent you from making many mistakes, but it will also let your teammates know that you know what you're doing and that they can do their best to try and support you because it is going to be worth it. But as usual, that doesn't mean that this is the only way to play the role, and that perhaps as someone who already understands all of the concepts introduced in this video, you might have already developed your own playstyle that differs from this. That's alright, since this is not meant to be a step-by-step guide for you to follow exactly as depicted here. This guide instead is meant to help you understand important concepts that should be a part of your thought process when making decisions. So this way, you are the one who's going to be equipped with the knowledge that gives you the autonomy to judge what are the best actions you can take at different moments on a match, creating your own playstyle, instead of blindly following someone else's opinion or doing something just because that's how it's done. Playing Slayer, contrary to popular belief, isn't at all an easy role, precisely because your job isn't to run around mindlessly looking for kills. But if you keep focusing on trying to shift the dynamics of control during a match, if you avoid feeding, if you're aware of how the clock is dictating the game, if you flank consciously, and if you play objective as a Slayer should, it should be already enough for you to be satisfied knowing that you're a good Slayer. And that's what you should focus on, since whether you win or lose isn't always only up to you. And that's my job here, and that's what I wish to you all, that you can have more fun playing the game by understanding it better and by becoming better players, taking comfort on the fact that you're playing your role correctly and that you're doing your part. Now, just in case you're unsure of what weapons to choose, here's a list of the currently most popular Slayer weapons, as I won't be able to list them all since there are too many of them, but having a look at what's popular can certainly give you an idea of what you're looking for in general for this role. I hope this video has helped you understand the Slayer role a little better. I really wanted to include in this video some gear builds that are popular with Slayer weapons, but the guide got way bigger than I expected. So I might go over that on a separate video some other time. But for now, if you need some advice, if you leave a comment, we can continue our discussion in the comments section, and I'll make sure to leave you a reply as soon as possible. Finally, if you've liked this video and you think it can be helpful to others, please make sure to share it with the people you know that might be interested so they can improve their game too. In this way, we can create together a better solo queue. Also, if you're interested, don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to check out my future videos, as I've got many other educational content in store. For the next video of the series, we'll be having a look at the backliner role with the infamous Chargers, and that is going to be very interesting too. And for today, that's all I got for you guys, so thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have a nice day.